The ANC, the country's governing party, comes full circle to the place where exactly 5 years ago it hatched its governance plans and carved out a policy path for the government it leads. On the 20th of December 2017, its then newly elected president, Cyril Ramaphosa, closed the conference inside Hall 6 behind me by declaring that the party was, quote, resolved to pursue with greater determination a radical path of socio-economic transformation premised on growth, job creation, and equitable distribution of income, wealth, and assets, end quote. Well, the venue itself, Nasrec Expo Center in Johannesburg, is a sprawl of a complex, with the main hall, Hall 6, being the center of focus over the next 3 days. And that's where the main plenary sessions will be taking place. And you can expect that the mood will be politically charged, with various interests on full display, including in that signature way that the ANC does it in song and dance. Several breakaway rooms are already set up, and that's where, to quote Mao Zedong, 100 flowers will bloom and 100 schools of thought will contend. If the ANC National Policy Conference had as its buzzword, if the third ANC National Policy Conference had as its buzzword the concept of a second transition, the 2017 National Conference, Policy Conference reverberated the words white monopoly capital and radical economic transformation. But as delegates start arriving from the heartland of South Africa into Johannesburg and the Nasrec Expo Center, it would seem the question that dominates at least the public discourse is to step aside or not to step aside. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. We are your GPS for the ANC Policy Conference over the next 3 days. We'll tell you what it all means and why it is important. In fact, let's get started. A big weekend ahead for the ANC as the policy conference gets underway. Delegates have registered at the Turffontein Racecourse here in Johannesburg. This conference will serve as a precursor to the Elective Conference, which will be held in December of this year. Lukhona Mnguni and Matlala Sitalugelo join me to unpack it all. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me and for your patience. So, Lukhona, just locate us where we are. It's a policy conference. Had we had a National General Council, which comes at the midpoint of the National Executive Committee's term to reflect on the implementation of policies, had we had that, we probably would have a bit of a insight into what's the mood nationally. But I imagine that we've been getting that from the regional and provincial conferences that have been taking place. Reading that mood, reading the documents, which one do you think will take center stage? Inward-looking ANC, consumed by factions and the Talibans and all the others? Or will it be an ANC that says, Mayday, Mayday, South Africa in crisis, we need to act, and we need to act this moment?
Well, to us, it's a bit of a difficult one, right? Because the last time we were here was 2017, December, at that national conference which elected President Ramaphosa. And he left with a very clear mandate that in the next 5 years, they've got to make sure that they renew the ANC and they unite the ANC. We are almost 5 years into that, and I think the regional conferences and numerous provincial conferences in this year and how tightly contested one those conferences are, and that's not to say conference should not be tightly contested, but tightly contested along factional lines, along polarizing statements, polarizing songs. I mean, some of the songs and the way in which comrades treat each other really does indicate that they still very much focus on the personalities, on the leadership rather than on the policies themselves. In fact, most of the provincial conferences have concluded their work without having had an opportunity to discuss policies, because you spend about 2 days just fighting it out and ironing out on the issue of credentials, which some people put it quite nicely to say it's a fight over the attendance register of who should be there and who should not be there. And I mean, this is something that the ANC should be well beyond. If it was a well-oiled machine, machinery as the oldest liberation movement and, of course, a party in government, it should be running much more efficiently than it does. Luckily here, you've got to fight about credentials, but it's not as serious as in an elective conference.
Sure.
There's no sense that you are going to elect anybody in this conference, but you must have, in the absence of the National General Council, which is designed in the constitution of the ANC to evaluate, one, whether the ANC policies and resolutions as agreed in the previous conference have been implemented, and secondly, to evaluate whether the leadership is still fit for purpose for the organization. Of course, some people then argue whether or not you can recall a person at an NGC and so on. Sometimes I think it's how you read the constitution and how you read what evaluation could lead to.
Yeah. Matlala, let me bring you into this. Just your sense of, the policy conference itself as a concept, the way that it is structured. One of the things that I will always give the ANC 10 out of 10 for is diagnosis. You read it even now, even as you go through these documents, you can find fault with prescriptions of how to fix it, but no one can fault them for diagnosis. Just that balance for you as you've been reading these documents. What's that balance looking like for you between diagnosing what ails South Africa, what ails the ANC, and what needs to be done about it?
I think, Tulas, as you correctly point out, the ANC gets 100% for diagnosis. The issue is the how part, how to fix the challenges that they have identified. I think Ibrahim spoke about state capabilities and capacities earlier. Look, implementations of policies for the ANC has rather been lethargic, to say the least. And there's no clear plan on how to improve state capabilities. We refer to state capabilities even though we talk ANC policy conference, because ultimately these policies must be implemented in government.
Yeah.
And the quality of public institutions that we have currently have also hindered the implementation process. But what has led to that low quality of public institutions that we have is this cadre deployment policy that is not necessarily merit-based, but is used to discharge chronism. And when you do that, the decline in the ANC, whether in capabilities, whether in intellect, tend to translate or spill over to the capacity.
Well, I imagine then you'll be pleased, Matlala, to see that part of what they're talking about, and I'm pretty much sure you saw it, is that at least in as far as public representatives are concerned, the idea is there now to say we may have to look even beyond people who are paid up, card-carrying members, to say, you've got the capability, you could help us. Do you think you could be a public representative for us? Does that begin to address your concerns?
Not necessarily, because I don't see that materializing.
The branches would push back, probably.
Yes. Remember that the ANC, in as much as it's presented to us as a vehicle to transform society, its essence, it becomes a vehicle to access state power. Hence, what we have in the ANC, as Lukona correctly referred to factions, is essentially different factions vying for political power or state power through the ANC. The intentions of many cadres within the ANC are not necessarily altruistic. Self-interest has characterized the kind of cadres, to borrow from the comrade speak, that ANC has in its own membership ranks. And that's where the challenge lies.
Yeah. And Lukona, you touched on the issue of the mandate coming from the 54th National Conference being about unify and renew the ANC. There's been the question of, can both be achieved realistically at the same time? Can you unify the ANC and renew it at the same time?
I think it was Crispin Peary at some point who tweeted to the effect that you cannot achieve these two things at the same time. It depends on your approach. The former now provincial secretary in KwaZulu-Natal said, comrades, we need to define what we mean by renewal, and made an example of a fence, that there will be comrades this side, and you put up a fence, and part of renewal will mean that some comrades remain behind and others go ahead. How do you achieve that in an environment when there is a retreat from the implementation of the ANC's code of conduct and disciplining people? Because what you talk about as step aside is actually a detour away from disciplinary proceedings. Because all it says is that just step aside, park there, and then we'll deal with you when your issues are finally done with. Meanwhile, the person is doing damage, wearing ANC colors, mobilizing ANC people, and doing all sorts of funny things, and getting people to go to court cases and attend there. That, in the eyes of the public, impugns the integrity of the organization. So you can't, first of all, and I've said this since we left Nasrec Tulas, 5 years on, I'm still singing the same song. Step aside is generally a bad resolution. Not because you don't want the ANC to act and regain its moral standing in society. It creates a political problem within the ANC of fracture, of fragmentation, of bitterness, and of uncertainty as to where people stay. The ANC should have been resolute. You know, in the 2010 National General Council, if you remember, in Durban, when President then, Jacob Zuma, was closing that National General Council, he made a serious call that the ANC would restore discipline in the ANC. And what did they do? They went ahead, they implemented disciplinary hearings. The likes of Malema were no longer in the ANC. The likes of Shivambus, some were suspended, some were sanctioned, and so on. You can't run an organization with a constitution and serious rules without being able to implement discipline. And I think part of what the ANC needs to do is not necessarily to see the idea of scrapping step aside as an opening of the gates for no disciplinary. The ANC has disciplinary structures. It has to implement them robustly.
So I'm telling you, you are with KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo.
Well, not because I've stayed there for too long. Not because I've stayed in Durban for too long, Tulas, but I do think, and I've been quite consistent, step aside is a bad resolution. There is a different way that the ANC should demonstrate seriousness. And part of that seriousness is to cut off these frills of people who are causing a problem for the organization. Why do you need to keep Zandile Gumede any longer in the ANC?
Look, I'm good. All right. All right, I'm going to thank you. She was nominated, by the way, unopposed. It's only
Fortunately,
for her
she declined.
saying that actually I'm not available. Gentlemen, thank you. We will continue having these conversations. There's another aspect, I don't have time to go into it, around social compacting and some of the public commentary that has gone before on it. But we do have the entire weekend to have some of these conversations. In fact, let's stay with the ANC policy conference. The party National Executive Committee member, Dakota Legoete, says there are some policies that they have not implemented and that the conference will address them.
Look, policy depends on the capacity of an organization. It also depends on the public fiscus in terms of us as the governing party. You would realize that some of the policies that we have managed to implement, there are others that we are still to implement. And I think the policy conference gives us an opportunity to relook and review some of the policies that we could not put them into action. And we are ready as the leadership to be taken to task by our structures and all in centre.
At the same time, lobbying has not stopped among some ANC provinces. Many go into the policy conference clear on which policies they want reviewed. KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo are eyeing the step-aside resolution. They both want it scrapped.
One of the great things that we will wish the policy conference to look at is the issue of the borderlines. We have realized that some of the foreign nationals that are coming to South Africa are seriously affecting the economy that is not able to grow. So we'll expect that we must come with a very strong policy that talks to the stringent measures that will actually be imposed at the level of borderlines. That is one of those. Secondly, as an organization, for obvious reasons, like any other province, we have fully reflected on the implication of the step-aside policy that seems to have been a thorny issue within the life and existence of the African National Congress. And it's our view that this policy conference should look at the possibility of having it reviewed, because in its current form, it doesn't help the African National Congress. Actually, it has caused more pain and more harm than good. A consequence of review is in two forms. One is either it changes its shape or we totally do away with it. And as a province, we have agreed that looking at the consequences of it, we have the view that it must be done away with it completely.